Welcome and thank you for joining the CIPD Southeast webinar as part of the CIPD Regional Series for a necessary conversation on the challenges facing women in the workplace, specifically gender pay gap and menopause. We are delighted to be hosting this event. Please note there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So when both of our speakers, Mary Connaughton and Catherine O'Keefe, have spoken, we will be welcoming any questions from the audience. So you can pop those in the chat box as we go along. I would like to introduce our first speaker, who will be taking us through the topic of gender pay gap, our Director of CIPD Ireland, Mary Connaughton. She will discuss women in the workplace, gender pay gap reporting, flexible working, and family-friendly practices currently out in the workplace. Mary is an advocate for the HR profession, educating, supporting, and informing policy. Her role as Director of CIPD Ireland means she is instrumental in leading the development and contribution of HR in Ireland, and she does a fine job of it too. We would like to thank Mary for always supporting the Southeast region over the years, and we look forward to her insights today. Thanks, Mary.
That's great. Thank you very much, Meg, for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be with you all here today. And I must say well done to you and the Southeast Committee for organising this event. And it really is landing at a time when I think women's issues and our role in the labour force is very much getting good focus. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk a bit about where we are at in terms of the labour market, the issues that we're facing, and how they're being addressed, and then talk a bit about the gender pay gap, where that's at, and the other legislation that we're facing. So let me just start by adding a bit of context to where women sit in our labour market. Now, for COVID-19 and the pandemic, women were far more impacted by the labour market than, say, in previous recessions. And that mainly reflected the sectors that we find are predominantly where women work, so services, hospitality, and health. And that meant that more women lost their income and lost their roles as a result. But this was a global trend, so it was very much what happened in Ireland happened globally. And it's a bit of a stark reminder when you think that somewhere like the World Bank came out this year to say that only 50% of women participate in the labour market across the globe in comparison to 80% of men. So there's a big gap there. Now, in Ireland, we don't have a gap that size at all, but there are some countries where women would have really low levels of participation. And what's been good to hear is that in recent months, the central bank has come out and said, now we're seeing higher levels of women participate in the labour market in 2022. So the growth that we're seeing in the economy is actually encouraging more women to stay and join the labour market. And that's great to hear. Now, as part of our HR practices survey that we did in 2021, we asked about what were the issues that were maybe gender-based or that were around caring that were coming up in the workplace. And we just found some interesting findings that I think are worth drawing attention to. So there was definitely a challenge around childcare, and that was seen by our respondents to have impacted on flexibility and productivity around the workplace. When we asked particularly around time off, we found that parents were taking time off much more than they usually would to care for elder parents or for children. So for men, we were told about 40% said they saw men take small amounts of leave to look after their children. And they said 44% said they saw women take small amounts of leave to look after their children. But then 20% said they saw women take significant amounts of time to take time off or annual leave to care for their children. So although everyone took small amounts of time, both men and women, when it came to actually needing to invest significant more time in childcare, that fell to women in the workplace. And there was also a significant worry about how childcare and caring responsibilities would pose obstacles to the return to work. So a lingering concern around how do we best manage this agenda going forward, both in terms of balancing work when it's at home and the workplace and childcare, so that it both attracts women into the workplace and supports them to stay there. So what we are seeing now, okay, so the central bank came out and they said the increase was up 3.5% to 59% of females in our labour force. And that's one of the highest on records. So that is really good progress in a very short space of time. And they put that down to the opportunity for remote working. And we know that the demand for remote working out there from both our research, from the research by NUI Galway, where they have done the national surveys, is that there's a very strong demand for a future that combines some form of remote and hybrid working. And, you know, when the numbers are coming through looking for that are over 80%, we know that's not just about females. We also have a pattern in Ireland whereby as we get a tight labour market, more females join the labour market. And that's what we're also seeing right now in the market. We're in a very, very tight labour market with under 5% unemployment. And we don't have young people who might have been traditionally coming out of school in high numbers or out of college. That's not happening anymore. And we have more people retiring. But we are seeing that employers are responding to the demand for hybrid and remote working. In our 2022 HR Practices Survey, over 80% said as part of their strategy to attract and retain talent, they were going to offer some form of remote or hybrid working. And that will be of value to the full workforce, to everybody in the workplace, all sorts of generations, male, female, and those from different race backgrounds, those with disabilities. So it is a really positive move. And it's one we do need to take hold of and hang on to. We asked about how do you think that will anticipate in terms of days at work? And what we found was in general that about over a third of companies thought people would be at work at the work site 2 days a week. And another third said about 3 days a week they would have people on site. And the rest were various different combinations. But that shows that we can see a lot of people will have that opportunity to work 2 or 3 days a week. What's interesting as we talk to companies, what we're finding is if they have brought in 2 days a week and they suggest to mandate a move to 3 days a week, there's a very strong kickback. So there's something psychological about that gap between working 2 days in the workplace and 3 days at home versus 3 days in the workplace and 2 days at home. And we know that caring responsibilities play into that, and the more flexibility that women have to be able to build their work around their life and their parenting responsibilities, the better. I suppose one of our concerns around the area of remote and hybrid working, and particularly if we see more women in that, because as yet we haven't got any statistics, because really companies are only rolling that out. But our concerns are around what happens when it comes to development opportunities and to promotion opportunities. Because there's a fear that over time, the mindset will shift to sort of recognizing and rewarding and offering opportunities to those who are physically on site in the workplace, and that those who aren't physically on site again become invisible. It was one of the biggest fears as to why people didn't opt for some form of flexible or remote working prior to the pandemic. So we do have to be very careful. And as a professional group, you know, we need to be very conscious of monitoring this. So there's a very strong emphasis on us to actually look and see where there are development opportunities, that it is being offered in delivery formats that suit those it's targeted at, which may be remote, not just face-to-face. And also when promotion opportunities come up, that applicants are coming from across the board, and that successful candidates are coming from across the board, and to be monitoring the level of male and females, both as applicants and as successful candidates. So it really worth putting policies and practices in place now to track that. And we know larger companies are very aware of this and are conscious of it, but until we actually start to track the data and start to share it and hear more about it, we won't fully know how that is impacting. The other area, of course, the other thing that's happening that we're finding out there is the gender pay gap. And what we are seeing now is that gender pay gap reporting for companies with over 250 employees will come into force next month. Now, the legislation took years to pass and was finally passed in 2021. And we have been waiting a long time to get the regulations to help us define the formula around doing that. So we were out in the media, and that put pressure on the department. So they've come out with some guidance around doing that. But in essence, what the requirement now is that companies with over 250 employees have to take a snapshot date in June, and that's the point at which they're going to calculate the gender pay gap for their organization based on the data from the previous 12 months. So if you pick the 10th of June, okay, you'll be looking at the period from the 10th of June 2021 until the 9th of June 2022. And you have to calculate your gender pay gap for that period, and you have to report it in December. So the matching date in December, or by December. So if you pick the date of the 10th of June, you have to report it by the 10th of December. So it's a very tight window for the first time, when only in the past 10 days have they released the regulations. And so the principles around what has to be reported have been there in the legislation, but the regulations are starting to define who do we include, how do we define pay, what do our calculations look like. In essence, what they are saying is that for every person, you need to calculate what their ordinary pay is for the previous 12 months. So come up with a total of what you've paid them for the previous 12 months. Then you have to do the same thing for bonuses and the same thing for benefit in kind. And then you also have to calculate working hours for them for the full year. And they do provide some guidance if you don't actually track hours. So related to what might be in a contract of employment and normal working hours. So they do recognize that not everyone is going to have working hour records. And then based on that information that you gather and in the guidelines, they provide the actual formula to calculate what your pay gap is between males and between females. They also explain how to rank employees, so taking the highest paid employee and ranking down everyone in order, and then converting that into quartiles. So you'll be taking the top then 25% to give you the top quartile of high paid people, and then you'll be able to have to report how many men and how many women are in that. And you'll have to do the same for every quartile. So top 25, the next between 75 and 50, then between 50 and 25 and below. And that gives a flavor of how your employee distribution works out. So we know one of the reasons for the gender pay gap is because we tend to have more men in senior positions, and senior positions are paid more. And that could be what your distributions into quartiles says. So it could say that at the top of the organization, you have 75% male and 25% female. And then when you come to explain your gender pay gap, then you can say, well, one of our issues is that we don't have gender balance at the top of the organization. But often then that is matched by cohorts of females at other levels in the organization. And so it could be that you have very high cohort of people between, say, 50 and 25, and they're mainly female, and there's very few males. So it's about being able to then understand what's the profile of the overall workforce, where do they bulge in terms of those quartiles, and how is that creating your gender pay gap. And one of the issues about the late timing is that, of course, although the principles about how this works have been there, the details are only coming out now about the Irish requirement, and yet companies have to have systems in place to actually do this right now, starting next month. Now, it also asks, as I mentioned, for you to explain what you're doing about it. Tackling the gender pay gap is not something that you can do in a very short space of time. When they brought this in about 5 years ago into the UK, they reported a gender pay gap around 13-14%. And in the following 12 months, it had actually increased on average minusculely. So no drop, even though it was now in the public arena, but actually a slight drop. A slight increase. And really what that's about is it does take time. If you have 75% male at the top of your organization and 25% female, you can't change that overnight. The key tools we have is trying to get the gender balance right. That can often mean bringing in more men at other parts of the organization. So it's not about just looking at the top, but looking down through. Are you attracting balanced numbers of male and female in each of your quartiles and in all of your job roles? Because often there's a risk that women will end up in lower paid roles and you could end up with men in higher paid roles. And even if you 50% numbers, you won't have equality in terms of pay. So it takes a lot of investment and time, looking at any bonus schemes, because that's often where we do find gaps. And that's why the government are asking for you to report on your bonuses, your average bonus that you're paying to men and women, so that can be looked at. And similarly for benefit in kind. Now, interestingly, one thing they haven't mentioned in the guidance is what to do with pensions. So it's just not mentioned before. So we're going to be trying to chase that down to get more information on that. And the other thing from our perspective that could happen is they don't say how to deal with statutory payments. So what to do with things like statutory sick pay or maternity pay. So if you are paying a top up, you could be saying that actually over, let's say, a pay top up for 4 months, over 4 months, we paid, a number of our women pay, but we had no working hours to go against that pay. And in fact, what it does is it bumps up the average pay of those women who've been on maternity leave. So that's a real watch point. If that's an implication of the formula that we're currently being presented with, that will create a difficulty because we'll be creating a smaller gender pay gap, but it's artificially fed by having a number of women on maternity leave. Now, it depends on the size of your organization, whether the numbers of women on maternity leave in a year will have that impact. But if you're a small organization and you have 2 women out, that could have a significant impact. Again, chase it up, see what we can do. What they've provided is very high level. There's good guidance on our website. We actually have a report that was developed for the UK gender pay gap reporting based on their experience over 2 or 3 years. So that's a guide to gender pay gap reporting in the UK. And they tend to follow that quite closely. They've told us that in principle, they're following the UK approach. So, that's worth looking at if you're a bit stuck to see, well, what have they done in the UK? Because we could get to see similar story in Ireland. And of course, along with gender pay gap, we also have things that, again, will hopefully help in terms of women's role. And that is the introduction of the right to request remote working, and for carers and parents of children up to 12, the right to request flexible working. Now, fundamentally, we believe the government should be bringing in the right to request flexible working for everybody, rather than having one cohort of employees with the right to request remote working and another cohort with the right to request flexible working. And we have a lot of support for that among our members to encourage people to do that. Now, neither sets of legislation are in place yet. The right to request remote working is very procedural and very much about trying to nearly tie an employer to stop them refusing it. But in any case, it does need to be treated fairly. When we talk about gender pay gaps and we talk about who takes up, who might use these requests, and we talk about men and women, we have to be very aware that pay gaps and requests for more flexibility in ways of working really come into play when women become mothers. It is a parenting issue. We don't see gender pay gap at the early stages of working life of people. We see it when they get to their 30s, and we see it as their family grows. So there is a strong connection between things like gender pay gap and families. And hence that shows the importance of actually having family-friendly policies to try to address that. Now, this is also encouraging more men to be involved in parenting. So we are seeing more, a couple of large organizations offer benefits that are equivalent to maternity pay to fathers. But more commonly what we're seeing is just an increase in family-friendly policies. And Justin, I'll finish on this point. We had a great example from Lidl at our annual conference last week when they talked about what they're doing for working parents. And they're bringing in new leave and supports around fertility and around miscarriage. They're bringing in menopause supports. And they're generally looking at what sort of policies and procedures will actually help them retain all the parents that they have and create a better employee experience for everybody. And more we're seeing that. We don't see maybe the procedures happening in such large organizations, but in small organizations. So small organizations tend to have fewer policies and procedures, but actually they tend to have greater flexibility. So, but often it's worth calling out that flexibility. So if people need time out to deal with family issues, they need to know they can go and ask under a general principle around flexibility. So we're going to have a lot to work on over the coming months as we deal with gender pay gap, remote working, flexible working, get our heads around all those. And certainly we'll be contacting the government and the relevant departments to try to make sure that what is coming to the fore is actually suitable and fit for purpose and will actually help make workplaces a much better place to be. So thank you today for listening to me. I'll hand back to Meg and happy to take questions later.
Thanks very much, Mary. And there is questions coming into me directly and into the general chat box. So we'll deal with those at the end. Never a quiet moment in the arena of employment legislation. So thanks very much for your insights there. Just to mention as well, we will be putting some useful links into the chat box as well as we go through the session today. So please take a note of those for yourselves. I would like to welcome our second speaker today, who is Catherine O'Keefe. She is a menopause workplace consultant and founder of Wellness Warrior and a creator of the Menopause Success Summit. Catherine has vast experience on talking on the topic of menopause, from RTE1 to TED Talks. That'll give you the depth of her knowledge, and most recently Monday night on RTE1, so well done on that, Catherine. She helps organizations implement a comprehensive menopause strategy that leads to meaningful change. She's helped over 150 companies choose support over silence, proactive steps and open dialogue. Catherine has a mission to shatter the menopause taboo for good. And we're delighted to welcome you today, Catherine.
Great, thanks Meg. To start, I'd like to share a story with you, and this is possibly a story you may have all heard in some way, shape or form. But Sarah was age 49 and been in her job for several years and highly professional, experienced and met her deadlines without any issues whatsoever. However, over recent months, Sarah's menopause symptoms had become more challenging, and restless sleep was a constant in her life. So to add to this, hot flushes, night sweats, lack of sleep plagued her. And as many of you may know, it doesn't stop the next morning when you get up to go to work. So daily now for Sarah, she's working from a place where her fuel tank was empty. She was running low on very few hours of sleep due to the intermittent night sweats, the restless legs, etc. The result being, when she woke up in the morning, she grabbed a quick breakfast, she ran out the door, or she went on to Zoom. She was operating on little fuel in her tank. And it may be when you're working from a place where you're missing sleep, you just won't make the best food choices that you may have made in the past. So she starts her day already depleted, but that tiredness, that exhaustion that comes, doesn't stop there. It follows you throughout your day. And for Sarah, that manifested as brain fog, memory issues, concentration issues. So this had a knock-on impact on her self-confidence and her self-esteem. What happened next was she started to miss deadlines. She started to feel under constant pressure to achieve, and her anxiety levels escalated. Sarah's story highlights 5 of the most common challenging symptoms that women report in the workplace: brain fog, anxiety, sleep issues, loss of confidence, and loss of self-esteem. These are the ones that I hear about on a daily basis. And the symptoms of menopause ripple on through a person's life. And one of the things to remember with menopause, it doesn't just impact the woman, it impacts everyone. And that's why I always say menopause is everyone's business. When you look at it, menopause typically happens between the ages of 45 to 55. And 1 in 100 women will go through an early menopause under the age of 45, and 1 in 1,000 under the age of 40. So, and on top of that, menopause can be caused by medical treatments and so forth. So the chances are at some point in your daily work, you are going to be working with women who can be experiencing natural menopause or some of the early forms of menopause. So we can't just think about menopause from the point of view of the natural average. We've also got to think about it from the earlier perspective, but also from the gender perspective. Menopause may impact all genders. And that's something that really needs greater awareness in workplaces. And, we have male menopause, which will affect roughly 30% of men due to a 1% decline in testosterone. The difference between male menopause and female menopause is that menopause is inevitable for all women. Andropause impacts just 30% of men until we've more research in that area. So it's really important to understand that there's such variety and complexity to menopause. And in your working day, either as a manager, HR manager, you're going at some stage in your work life, you're going to see all aspects of it. Sadly, we know that the early forms of menopause are on the increase. It might surprise you to know that the youngest woman I've ever worked with was age 9. She was in 3rd class in primary school when she started to experience hot flushes and night sweats. So as you can imagine, that's a very different experience. But at the age of 9, at some point you will start a working life, but the requirements, the treatment options are very, very different for some of the early forms of menopause. So if we also look at it, from, and Mary touched on this earlier when you're looking at the gender pay gap, but if we look at it for natural menopause, women aged 40 to 50 tend to be at the peak of their careers. And the years of wisdom and knowledge that they've gained, it makes them instrumental in the workplace. However, for many, they're faced with the additional challenge that is menopause. So for those in senior management roles, or high profile roles, the pressure, just like Sarah's story earlier, the pressure to maintain that excellence throughout your everyday can be extremely challenging. And you add another side to that, to the woman who's maybe on the factory floor and might be wearing synthetic uniforms. That makes a hot flush a cold dread, because it'll exacerbate the experience. So when you add then to the work role, but then you also add daily life stresses on top of that, the stress of this can all become unmanageable. We know in the UK, 1 in 4 women will leave their job due to menopause symptoms. We know the global productivity loss due to menopause is $150 billion globally. So menopause needs to be addressed. It needs to be supported in the workplace. And I'm going to go through in a few minutes some of the key steps that you can take to do that. But, first off, why do we want to do it? Why should we support menopause in the workplace? Well, when we look at it, first off, is the positive impact it has on productivity. And we know that it will reduce sickness and absence leave. Being supported in the workplace changes the trajectory the experience a woman will have. It also impacts morale, staff retention, and a big one, an evolving one, is that it promotes diversity and inclusion. Because remember, transgender man, transgender woman will have an experience through these menopause years as well. And I think a very important point is that supporting the conversation, you are then a supporter of women. You are a supporter of a person going through menopause, and you are a good employer. And possibly one of the most important points for me is that you become a community and socially responsible citizen within your workplace, because menopause is 360. It doesn't just impact the workplace. It impacts a person in all aspects of their life, from the home life to their work colleagues to society. So having that support in work is crucial in terms of forming overall community support. So I think that's a really important point, and often it isn't one that's looked on too much. But I know when I was my background before I started working in this space, I was a director with an investment bank for over 20 years. And I know it was one of the big things that we always looked at from a management perspective was, you know, being the social responsible citizen. And I think this is a really important part of that conversation, because if we support women, and when we support women, remember, you're not just supporting the woman, you're supporting the family unit, you're supporting their friends, you know, children, etc. So it's a much bigger conversation. So if we look at this just very, very high level, how can you support menopause in your workplace? And I kind of, there's 7 key steps, very high level, that I would say just to be conscious of. And the first one is the role. It's really important to look at menopause from the role a person is doing. Someone who's in a synthetic made, highly synthetic made uniform on a factory floor or in retail, or, you know, whatever job they're in, that uniform potentially could really exacerbate their symptoms. So it's really important to look at the role. If you're someone who's experiencing severe aches and pains and they have to stand all day, that's going to impact their experience. On the same side of that, if you do have someone who has severe aches and pains and they're sitting all day, that might impact. So it's really important to look at the role and follow the role all the way through, from onboarding all the way through, so that you get a really good handle of how in a specific role you can support a woman. The next one is the symptoms. Now, the symptoms of menopause, if you Google it, you'll be told they're somewhere between 36 and 38. My actual current list, based on thousands of women I've worked with at this stage, is over 50. But it's what's really important to understand is the breadth of the symptoms. It's not just hot flushes and night sweats. They are the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to it. So it's really important for anyone working with women to really understand what menopause is about, and understand the symptoms and understand how they can impact. Because you may not think about brain fog, and you may not, you know, understand the fact that, you know, in Sarah's situation, when she wasn't performing in her job, the impact that had on her confidence and her self-esteem. It's a really big challenge for so many women, that their confidence is so dramatically impacted in the workplace in these years. So it's kind of just thinking a little bit further in relation to the symptoms. And the other thing about the symptoms is that they don't just come and go very quickly. The menopause transition is anywhere from 3 to 12 years. So as a woman goes through that, there's different symptoms going to be experienced throughout those years. So that means you've got to be flexible. That means you've got to be able to tweak with the role as things change. So that's really, really important, because there's such a wide variety of symptoms that different things will be required at different times. So another one is looking at the reasonable adjustments, and there's these two actually kind of tie in together. So the reasonable adjustments and the Equality, the Employment Equality Act of 2010, where, you know, it's a legal duty to make reasonable adjustments in the workplace. And that kind of brings you on to the practical things that you can do in the workplace. But that brings you back to the role. And you have to, you know, take into account what will support a woman in the given role that she's in and the challenges that she's experiencing. If you have a woman in your team and she may have bladder issues, then for her, being located close to the restrooms is going to be really important. Or it may be, you know, it might be the aches and pains again, and it might be that, again, just the ability or flexibility to have more breaks might be really important. But so there's many symptoms to take into account, because if you have someone who's really going through an anxious period, which is really common, then, you know, they might need, you know, they might want to be in front of people too much. So again, it's just having understanding about, you may have somebody who never had an issue with anxiety before, and all of a sudden as they go through perimenopause into menopause, anxiety might become quite a challenge for them. So it's really understanding menopause and the symptoms is really, really important. So some of the other practical things that you can look at are like, you know, desk fans, location of the desk, maybe keeping away from bright sunlight if someone, you know, is experiencing heat and so forth. So it's really just thinking practically about how you can support in the workplace. A really fantastic thing that I've worked on with a lot of companies recently is what they call the cot-out kit or the Bridget's basket, and that is basically where you might have a little kit in your restrooms that might include sanitary products, disposable panties, maybe face wipes or body wipes, things like that. And that's a really nice addition if you can include it. Another thing to be aware of is the tribunals. And when we look at Ireland, we have no published official tribunals that we can refer to. And the reason for that is simply because they haven't happened. Well, they have happened, but they will have been settled outside of court, because nobody wants the reputational damage that comes with being brought to court over issues around the treatment of menopause. But if we look to the cases from the UK, you will find in the majority of cases, it was a lack of knowledge, a lack of awareness where the employer made mistakes. So it's really good to understand the various tribunal cases around menopause, so you can just be aware of how to protect yourself, you know, in whatever role you're doing, and also protect the employer. So that's a really important point as well to be aware of. One of the most ridiculous cases was the famous Bon Marché case. I'm not sure if you know them. They're kind of a cafe chain, like Starbucks or something. But one of the managers, every time she got a hot flush, her manager used to refer to as dinosaur. You know, so there's just things that happen that were just, you know, so basic and it just shouldn't have happened. But I'd really encourage you just to be aware of the tribunals. The other point is, this is a big one. Menopause is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. I know it's having its moment and it feels like it's everywhere, but this is a huge change. It's not just in Ireland, it's happening the world over. I will tell you, we're edging up. We're very progressive in the work that Ireland has done to date. The US, Canada are far behind us. The UK are slightly ahead of us. So, you know, we are making progress, but supporting menopause in the workplace cannot be a flash in the pan. It has to be an ongoing, compassionate conversation from senior management all the way down across all levels of the organization. So part of that is making sure that you have annual training in place, however that looks for your workplace, but you need to commit to it on a long-term basis. And then the last one is menopause opportunities. And when we look at that, it's like giving your employees, your work colleagues, opportunities within their working day and asking them what they'd like. Maybe it might be that they'd have an informal meetup once a month and that they could chat in a very safe, confidential space about menopause. You know, there might be different things that they might like to do. So it's kind of doing a collaborative, working collaboratively with your employees to look at how can you improve the support within menopause. When I engage with corporate or individual clients, our starting point is always about understanding the bigger picture, the journey that the client wants to embark on with their employees. And that's how together then we create a plan of action that's tailored for every workplace, with the underpinning of looking at the role of each woman is performing. Menopause training and support and guidance needs to be deeply integrated into organizations as a priority. And with it impacting almost all women, it simply makes sense. That's thank you. So if there's any questions, Meg, I'm happy to go through questions. And can I just say, I purposely didn't mention a menopause policy. You can ask me why if you like.
Thanks very much, Catherine. That was very informative. Yeah, there is a few questions that came in, so we might go to you first, and then there is some for Mary as well. So I suppose the first question was, what kind of practical steps can companies take to support menopause? So I know you mentioned a few, a few practical bits, but where do you start the journey, Catherine, do you think?
And that's kind of why I don't mention a policy, because you don't start with a policy. And the reason I feel strongly that you don't start with a menopause policy is because what women and even partners want to see, they want to see practical steps. They want to see that you are, because a policy can take a lot of time. A guidance is a little bit more fluid, so may not take as much time, but they want to see it happening now. They don't, a policy could be 6-9 months down the line by the time you get it written, okayed by HR, etc. They want to see action on the floor. They want to see that you are openly supporting menopause. So the practical changes that you can start to incorporate, that's to me far more important. And I know I get that feedback, like from, hundreds of women. They'll say the policy, yeah, grand, but give me the other stuff. Show me that you're actually supporting the conversation. So how do you start to do that? You have to start talking about it. You have to start openly supporting it, and by doing education sessions, workshops, and that's the work that I do. And then on top of that, it's, what I encourage people to bring it up with either their HR or their manager if they feel comfortable. Disclosure is always at the onus of the employee. You need to be very, very mindful of that, unless for some reason you're potentially on a performance management route where you might have gotten medical information and you may know that it's part of the challenges that a woman may be experiencing. But, starting it then is really, looking at, those practical things, the fans, the cot out basket, the vending machines, the cafeteria, the restroom facilities. There's a whole host of things that you can look at. But the most important thing is always identified by the role, because you could have two people doing the same role in your workplace, but they could have completely different experiences of menopause. You could have two people doing two completely different roles, and they can have completely different experiences. No two women will have the same experience of menopause. So you have to, as managers and HR personnel, it's really important to realize you've got to be completely flexible in your approach on a one-to-one basis, because you could in one day you could talk to two women going through menopause and they'll be having completely different symptoms. That's really important, because that's where respect comes into the conversation as well.
And Catherine, I suppose just to expand on that a little bit, you're talking about I suppose opening up workshops and opening up the dialogue and that kind of thing. If you don't have the traction and you don't get the people are maybe a bit, reluctant to come forward. And how do you overcome that obstacle? How do we as HR professionals and managers do that?
Yeah, I think you will find it comes from so many different places. It could come from a D&I element. It could be that an employee asks for you to support it, or it could be you yourselves decide to bring it up. But the thing is to start the conversation. So it's, even if it's going to your management and it's basically saying, listen, everyone knows it's there, and it's out there now, and it's been building for the last 4 or 5 years. There's no getting away from this one, Meg. And it's literally like every workplace is going to have to address menopause at some point. Now, a menopause policy isn't mandatory. I don't think it ever needs to be mandatory, but I do think it's the right thing to do. So I think where you want to start though is start on the practical. And just to mention, I've seen policies that are 3 pages long. I've seen them 30 pages long, because I'd work with different companies on them. There's no right or wrong. Where they're lengthy, it's because there's more roles, so they want to differentiate more. But I think it's just get the conversation going, because I've worked with companies who will say, oh, we raised it about a year ago and we didn't get much uptake, and now we know we want to go back to it. So I think it's just starting the conversation, in every opportunity you can is the first place forward, because there's no point you going, sending out blogs or doing anything like this if you're not starting to get a bigger traction on it. And remember, men are a really important part of this conversation, and at all times they have to be encouraged to come on board with it as well.
Just picking you up on that point, and then I'm going to go over to Mary on the, men are an important part of this conversation. It did come into the chat there. How do we engage men in the conversation more? Looking at the list of attendees today, this particular person noted, it was there was a heavy ballot, over to the female side. So how do we support men to kind of become part of the conversation and to?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've worked with 2 companies to date who've actually made the workshops I've done, they've made them mandatory. Okay, now that was specific HR and manager training. You'd love that you wouldn't have to do that. You just want to encourage all men to come. I think that's down to the communication. So, when you're communicating anything in relation to workshops, it's really, it's sitting down at those team meetings and just making sure that men understand how important this is, and that this isn't the laugh and the snigger and that may have been in the past. Menopause is a deeply psychological transition and chapter in a woman's life, and it has to be respected for that. And that respect, I think we need to just make sure that men get that, and that, and also what's really important is that they understand. They're, maybe thinking, I won't see, someone in my team unless they're 45, 50, they need to be aware that the chances are they're going to see somebody younger, and the chances are they're probably going to see somebody also kind of on a gender basis that they may not be familiar with also. So I think that needs to be part of the education piece as well. It's very important.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. I'm just going to pop over to Mary for a sec, if that's okay. Mary, we had a question there that asked, has there been any guidance on how to report or represent employees who identify as non-binary or different than male and female? And if not, what do you think is going to happen?
To date, we haven't. So what we've seen is initial guidance, and it's obviously a preliminary document from the government because they weren't ready with their regulations. We tend to see that the official figure relates back to what's the official nearly birth status of the individual. That, like, for example, when they talked recently about the work-life balance bill, they talked about some of the entitlements where they were going to go to a transgender person. You needed the Gender Recognition Act document. So probably the best thing to do is to look at through the official lens. But I mean, there isn't a rule on it. So there isn't anything that says you can't do what you choose to do locally. Maybe they'll come out with a rule. But in the absence of a rule, if you do something that is the felt right thing to do in circumstances, we don't know that this is going to be a big volume of people. So hence, it may not have a big impact on your data.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And then we have another person asking that we had said, you had indicated that maybe the gender pay gap is a parenting issue. And is it maybe the case that it is actually linked to the age and the fact that career progression really kicks in your 30s or 40s, which is coincidental with the age of becoming a parent for a lot of people?
Yes, they're very combined. I mean, that just shows it's not a single solitary issue when we talk about it. So there is no single solitary solution. But certainly the CSO did a piece of work a year or two ago where they tracked age and parenting, and certainly the gender pay gap was maximized in the early in 30s and 40s. But they could also see that it was linked to having more than one child. So there are a couple of trends there. It's not easy. It can play out differently in every organization depending on the profile of the workforce.
Okay, very good.
Interesting just to say, in our research, we asked companies what they think the government should do. So, and one of them was to take more action in schools to promote better gender balance in terms of future careers. But another one was to actually run a campaign to explain the difference between equal pay and gender pay, because it is something that does get confused. And for anyone who's currently looking at having to do a report in December, starting that education pattern internally about what is the gender pay gap versus what is equal pay. Because the hardest audience to convince is actually your internal audience. Yes, it'll has to go on your website and it'll be visible externally, and at some point it'll go on a government website, but actually you have to communicate it internally. And when you say to a team that, well, yes, actually, you know, we do have a gender pay gap of, even if you're at the national average of about 14%, the people look at us, okay, so does that mean the men in my team are being paid more than the women in my team? So you can start that education now about what's the difference between equal pay and the gender pay gap, and that will help maybe smooth the path then down the road.
Okay, and then finally for you, Mary, just I know you had indicated some proactive steps that can be taken, but say for the smaller organizations that don't yet have to report, but maybe they want to do the exercise and prepare themselves and ready themselves for a couple of years down the track, what proactive steps can they take to look to reduce their gender pay gap before it gets to their time to report?
Well, the first thing, of course, they can do is they can measure it. So, you know, go through the exercise. You have smaller numbers to deal with, but actually go through the exercise. So the next cohort who will be covered will be companies between above 150 employees. And then the following year, the next cohort will be companies with over 50 employees. And then it means you can put much more attention on things like your recruitment and your selection process. So, and your promotion process. So if you're finding you're a small company, you have a large gender pay gap, you don't have to publicize it, but what are you doing to get a better balance at senior levels in your organization? Now, in an organization of under 100 employees, you can change that balance quite easily by changing the people at the top, because that will have an impact overall, whereas one or two more high-paying people in a large organization won't have the same impact, but in a small organization. So look at how you can develop the women you have into senior roles. So look at how you can be very conscious in your recruitment of trying to get a much better gender balance at all stages of it. You're not in a position to dismiss people based on this. So we do know that organizations that have a predominantly male workforce or predominantly female workforce will struggle, because by nature of having one or the other, you're likely to find you don't have gender balance in the rest of the organization. So it's work in progress. Understand the profile of your company and what you can do, and understand what your gender pay gap is, would be the best starting points.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. And thanks very much, Catherine. I'm just conscious that the time is ticking on and people will be wanting to have their lunch. So I would like to thank you both sincerely for taking the time today. It was informative and useful. And we hope that everybody who joined us today felt so too. I'd also like to thank my committee, as always, and CIPD Ireland. It's very important that we continue to network, whether it be virtual or in person, and we really value these occasions where we can brainstorm and look at developments within our sector. So I'd just like to highlight as well, the next event in the regional series will be the 8th of June, and it will be held by the Western region. So that's the employment law update, and you can go to Eventbrite and book in for that. So I'd just like to thank you all again and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thanks, Meg.